We've been hearing a good deal tonight about how AMEX is conducting its operations in Namibia and how they affect the Namibian struggle for independence. There is another aspect of their operation that affects us in the United States, and that is the role that the United States government plays in enabling AMEX to invest in Namibia, and the cost that we as American citizens pay for that. The State Department has always talked with pride about its policy toward Namibia. The United States has supported some resolutions at the UN urging South Africa to get out of Namibia, but its policy is primarily to engage in a kind of mild form of lectures. It has blocked efforts to put pressure, real pressure on Namibia to leave by refusing to support any form of sanctions against South Africa. Even an arms embargo, which it claims to be enforcing unilaterally, the United States will not support as a mandatory action at the United Nations. The United States accepted in 1971 the opinion of the International Court of Justice that South Africa's occupation of Namibia was illegal. And after that, the State Department announced that it would be official policy to discourage further investment in Namibia by American corporations. State Department representatives will tell you that if anybody asks whether or not they should invest in Namibia, they inform him that the official policy is one of discouragement. And they will explain that the United States will not protect the investment or finance exports or imports with Namibia through the Exim Bank. In this way, the United States claims that it is doing everything it can to discourage investment in order that investment will not strengthen the illegal regime. But there is one loophole which I want to refer to. And it's a rather major loophole because AMEX has profited from it to the tune of millions of dollars every year. American Metal Climax and all American companies that operate in Namibia can take credit for the amount of taxes that they pay to the illegal South African administrators of Namibia. They can take that as a credit against the taxes that they would otherwise owe to the United States government. This is how it works. In 1970, for example, AMEX paid $14 million into the South African treasury in Pretoria. This represented 1/3 of their profits from the Tsumeb mine. When AMEX then computed the taxes that it owed to the United States Internal Revenue Service on its worldwide profits, it could subtract the entire $14 million. This meant that AMEX made $14 million more in profits than it would have otherwise. And without this credit, mining in Namibia would certainly be considerably less profitable because the tax rate would be 83% instead of 50%. It also means that you and I and other American citizens paid $14 million more in taxes that year for the social services that we wanted to have in the defense budget that we didn't want to have. And that tax revenue doesn't go that far. The people who benefit from this tax credit policy then are AMEX and its stockholders and the South African government. The people who lose are the Namibian people and us. It could be argued, I think, that we shouldn't pick up on the tax credit issue because after all the United States has a reciprocal agreement with almost every other industrialized nation to allow for tax credits to avoid double taxation. But there are two serious weaknesses with this argument. The first of them deals with Namibia and its peculiar legal status. In 1972, the Nixon Treasury Department made a specific finding that companies could take credit for taxes paid to South Africa for their operations in Namibia. They were asked for a ruling by Congressman Diggs, and Treasury based its ruling on two main points. First, the administration pointed out that Section 901 of the Internal Revenue Code that allows for tax credits had been previously interpreted so as to allow companies to take a credit for taxes paid to a government which the United States didn't recognize, such as, for example, the People's Republic of China or Nazi Germany during World War II. And so they claimed that if the United States allowed a tax credit for South African taxes, it had nothing to do with the fact that Namibia's, the occupying power, South Africa, is illegally there. It has nothing to do with that. Secondly, the Treasury ruled that a foreign tax should be credited even if it's imposed on income that wasn't all earned inside the taxing country, namely South Africa. Even if the tax was completely outside South Africa's jurisdiction, had no business doing it, nevertheless, the tax should be credited. However, the bilateral tax agreement between the United States and South Africa does not provide for any kind of tax credit on income that has its source outside the country involved. The tax credit issue was decided purely on a technical ground in terms of the Internal Revenue Code. One ground on which the administration and the new administration, if it really wanted to, could reverse the ruling is this. Allowing tax credits for taxes paid on Namibian incomes, I would say, is contrary to public policy. The United States public policy is to discourage investment, at least that's what they say. So it is time that we could use this handle and say no more tax credits for Namibian incomes. Quite apart from these intricate legal questions, it's quite clear that AMAX's taxes that are paid to South Africa do actually strengthen South Africa's illegal administration in Namibia. South Africa has worked very hard to make it very difficult for people to find out just what they do with the Namibian economy, but it is very hard to say exactly what the payment of more than $150 million in taxes by AMAX since it started mining in Namibia has meant in terms of Namibia's development. Namibia doesn't even have a separate budget anymore, so the taxes paid by the companies in Namibia get added into the general South African tax revenues. But interestingly enough, the officials of the Tsumeb mine themselves have given us an idea of what their taxes have meant for Namibia. In 1971, the manager of the Tsumeb mine, whose name is J.P. Ratledge, said in an interview, quote, "If we had not been operating, the development of Southwest Africa would not have progressed at all," unquote. But his definition of, quote, development seems to be closer to that of the South Africans than the Namibian people's definition. He said that their taxes had made possible the construction of paved roads through the country, including the northern stretch of the road from Cape Town through Windhoek and all the way to Luanda. Of course, the Tsumeb mine is the main beneficiary of this part of the road since it provides for the transport of mined copper. The South African administration also benefits. Very few Namibians have any cars that could use the road, but it has been used for other purposes. South Africa and the Portuguese used it to transport war material. And so the road can be very useful for South African tanks and armored cars if they're on their way to Luanda or wherever, now or in the future. The second argument you often hear against fiddling with the United States tax law is that taxes should not be manipulated for political purposes, ours. Whether or not you agree with this abstract principle, the tax credit provision has in fact been used recently for very clear political purposes and could be used again if we really meant that we were going to discourage investment in Namibia by making it completely unprofitable. Last year, Congress, for example, passed a law providing that corporations which agree to participate in the Arab boycott against Israel can't get tax credits for their operations in countries that require companies to participate in a boycott. It's interesting to note that the law, which is Section 999 of the Internal Revenue Code, defines participation in an international boycott to include refraining from employing individuals of a particular nationality, race, or religion. On the face of it, it looks as if this law is relevant to Namibia and even to South Africa, since South Africa is the one nation in the world which by law requires discrimination against its own citizens on the basis of race. If this law were broadened just a little bit to include not only refraining from employing certain individuals, but also discrimination in employment against individuals on the basis of race, nationality, or religion, then companies in Namibia and South Africa would by necessity be participating in a boycott by virtue of operating under South African law. What can we do about this? The new Carter administration is becoming deeply involved in both Zimbabwe and Namibia, following in the footsteps of Mr. Kissinger in shuttle diplomacy last year. The United States and 4 other Western members of the United Nations Security Council have just had one meeting with Prime Minister Forster on Namibia, and the representatives of these countries are meeting with him next week. So now is the time to put pressure on the administration to put real teeth into its policy against South Africa's occupation of Namibia. We should set some guidelines if we expect, or at least some benchmarks for how we measure what the new administration is going to do, or what it should do. We could call on on Carter's Treasury Department to change the ruling made during the Nixon years and to deny tax credits to companies operating in Namibia as a centerpiece of a new aggressive policy. This might be a political possibility. Vice President Mondale, whom Carter has just given special responsibility for policy formulation toward Africa, introduced a bill in the Senate in 1974 to deny tax credits to companies operating in Namibia. So this should not be an entirely foreign issue to Mr. Mondale. But on the other hand, the Carter administration, like the Nixon administration, is basically pro-business in its own trilateral way, and so we should have no illusion that the administration will in fact deny tax credits for Namibian operations tomorrow without any pressure or any raising of the issue. If the administration does not make an executive ruling on the tax credit issue, it would be possible to go again to Congress. Leadership in both the House and the Senate has come out opposing Namibian tax credits, so it could be that we should encourage them to move on this issue, to push to get legislation passed through Congress to require the Treasury Department to deny tax credits. This is a major kind of task, and since it clearly is something that would not get the support of AMAX, to say the least, it's one that's worth pushing if we are committed to setting a benchmark to trying to end U.S. support for minority rule in Southern Africa. Thank you.
You suggested that some of the things this country might do would be that we could push Carter or we could push the Treasury to do this or that. How do we push anybody in a nation where the connection between the government policy and the homogeneity of the media is such that we seem to have little voice in changing such major policy as you've described?
Well, I think that it is a question of my own view is that you raise these issues in order to increase the consciousness of the people, and that you don't not necessarily hoping that the tax credit issue is going to get through Congress even, but that it is a way of educating people about the way their tax money is used. It does make a connection with what's happening in this country, and so therefore I think it's useful. There are other ways of addressing oneself to the task of educating people about the nature of the society they live in. A group out in the San Francisco area and a group in the California area have taken on the question of Del Monte. Del Monte, for example, imports sardines from Namibia, and a boycott of Del Monte is another way of raising the same issue and having an educational kind of effect. So I'm not saying really that the tax credit issue is going to go through Congress if everybody gets geared up, but I think there is a value, it seems to me, in demanding this of a Congress person and saying, what is your position? And it can be a form in which education is raised around a primary or around an election campaign. But I am under no illusions. The constituency for that is minute in this country.
Since the president is supposed to be solely responsible, supposed with the consent of the Senate, for the foreign policy of the United States. What are the chances of him, what, is it any way an executive order could be passed, you know, like it's in the national interest to restrict the companies that operate in Namibia?
The president certainly has the power to try to discourage investment, or to take steps to discourage it. I would think that the passage of this kind of a Treasury ruling is certainly something that the administration could do without going to Congress. I don't know what other steps you have in mind. I don't know. I certainly don't think that in terms of export control, I should think that the government probably could control any exports to Namibia. Certainly, there's no reason why the United States government can't vote in the Security Council for a resolution that finds South Africa's presence in Namibia a threat to the peace. If that's the case, then you can have sanctions against South Africa in terms of at least export of arms that would be far more effective than what we've got now. That's a kind of litmus paper test that Andy Young ought to be, you know, he's going to have to face that in June. And I'm sure that that resolution will come. And so the question is whether the United States is prepared to vote for that. I don't know which way they're going to do that. They're talking about a really a peculiar kind of a resolution that Young has been talking about, which is that you'll have a mandatory sanctions on arms, but only apply it to Namibia, which I don't understand that. For years, we had supposedly an embargo against Portuguese arms if they were to go into the Portuguese colonies. But the United States supplied Portugal with NATO weapons, and they always got down, somehow or other, down to Angola and Mozambique. So I don't really think you can have a partial embargo on Namibia. I don't understand that.
I appreciate your focusing on that one issue and trying to be very tactical, but how do you deal with what Professor Rhodes was talking about, this neo-colonial variant, which it certainly looks as if the Carter administration's policy is moving toward that, and perhaps within the next year or so they will come all out in favor of developing a independent government in Namibia, with AMAX and other companies working directly with that independent government.
Well, I didn't understand most of what Professor Rhodes said. He must know a lot more about that fund than I do, but let me say a couple of things, because I've really been following the Zimbabwe Development Fund much more closely than the Namibia Development Fund, and I have had access to some papers that were produced for this African American Scholars Council project last summer. And precisely what the Zimbabwe Development Fund is, I don't know, because nobody's ever seen it except Ian Smith and the people at Foggy Bottom. But the United States Congress is being asked for $100 million this year as the first of a 5 installment payment. Now, that will amount to $520 million. We don't know whether the Namibia deal is another $500 million or whether it's $100 million. But I mean, I point out to you that Namibia has a population that's not more than 1 million, and Rhodesia has a population of 6 million. But that there never has been any fund of that size ever applied to an African country before. And if you looked at Zaire, if you looked at Tunisia, if you looked at Egypt, if you looked at any one, there never has been any such proposal. I think that some of that money in Rhodesia is going to go to buy out the whites in terms of their farms, in terms of their civil service, in terms of a number of other things. Although the State Department refuses to say that it's going to be used for that purpose. They say it's not a buyout, but in fact Smith understands it that way, and I would think that the Namibia fund would also be used. Now, the question really comes down to this. As far as Zimbabwe is concerned, the Patriotic Front has rejected the idea of this fund. Now, you can appropriate the money, you can say you're going to give it to the World Bank, you can say that if you have an independent Zimbabwe, that money will be there, et cetera, et cetera. But if the Patriotic Front comes to power, as I anticipate they will, through an armed struggle, then you know that fund is going to be a dead letter. So, sure, it's a neo-colonial scheme, but I don't think it's going to come to any effect, because I think that actually the Congress probably is not going to appropriate the money. I don't know. I mean, that's my guess. If you ask me whether they're going to appropriate $100 million for a Namibia fund, I don't think they're going to do that either. Congress may be terribly stupid in some ways, but they're awfully good at not appropriating money for undescribed foreign operations of that kind. I don't see it myself. My sense is that there's going to be an awful lot of opposition to that. So maybe it's a terribly clever neo-colonial scheme, but I don't think it's going anywhere right at this moment, because A, it's not going anywhere in terms of the Patriotic Front in Zimbabwe, and B, I don't see it going anywhere with SWAPO. I mean, if the armed struggle continues the way it's going in both places, I would think that it would be very difficult to install Muzorewa, for example, in Zimbabwe, and it would be very difficult to get anybody to accept the Turnhala Conference. I don't think that has any viability. Even in the administration, I don't think it has. But there I could be wrong.
Did you bring some documents with you relating to the General Counsel's opinion and the resolution which we're supposed to comply with?
I'd like to have an opportunity to submit that for the record. I have some documents, yes. This is a tax policy memorandum from the Internal Revenue Service, and it illustrates the points I made in regard to tax policy.
Okay, thank you very much. No, we've really got to move along. Thank you. Our next witness is going to be Ev Ehrlich. He is a staff assistant on the staff of Congressman Conyers' office, and we're very glad that he's sat here this evening and listened to this and is going to impart some aspects of the effect of all this on the United States in terms of where the loss of revenue goes and where it doesn't go. That's here. Ev, if you'd introduce yourself and.
Okay. My name is Dr. Everett Ehrlich. I'm an economist in the Washington staff of John Conyers. Pardon me.
Let me move this closer.
Is this all right? At first, it ought to be made pretty clear that the loss of tax revenues because of the subsidization of the export of capital is really a minor loss compared to the larger losses the economy suffers. We lose directly through the flight of capital abroad between 150,000 and 200,000 jobs a year, although that number is very, very difficult to measure. Moreover, our tax bases suffer. Firms use their multinationalization or their transnationalization to hide their profits. I saw the statement made earlier that $14 million in taxes were paid on $42 million of profit. That number, $42 million, can't be correct. I see the number that the Tsumeb mine, 1970, produced $26 million in profit. That's probably a gross underestimation. The firms that are operating these enterprises operate in several different product lines and several different stages of production in several different countries. So they simply take the product out of Namibia, they move it up through the line of ownership to a tax-free port, Panama, Bermuda, Hong Kong, and they declare the profit there. They up the value of the price, and then they sell it to an American or a European or a Japanese parent company, and the profit occurs in the tax-free port. And virtually all nations lose revenue to global corporations in this fashion. All localities in the United States lose revenues because they have to compete with each other to give tax concessions to enterprises for jobs. So there are a large number of losses associated with this sort of multinationalization of the world's wealth and the fact that the world's productive system is in fact coming under one rule. The direct losses associated with this sort of subsidy are several $billion a year. Right? That's because of the tax credit given, because of the services of the Agency for International Development, because of American contributions to the World Bank. Moreover, there's now the possibility that the United States is going to have to subsidize in some way, shape, or form an international chain of banking failure, because American multinational banks have, from a banking sense, in an imprudent way, lent money to developing nations who have to finance massive deficits in their trade because they're hooked on American technology and through the royalty and patent system. What could be done with this money instead? One thing that we could do to tie it directly to the situation we're dealing with is put it into a new international economic order, such as that recommended by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That in fact we could use that to subsidize the development of indigenous technology and local production facilities in the third world, right? And then we could eliminate the necessity of having an international division of labor where the United States does the sort of on-paper production and the rest of the world does the real production. The United States does the banking. Right? We could do that. That could take the funds. There are several other national projects that require doing in the United States. There's an incomplete health system. There's an incomplete system of income maintenance. I brought with me, and I'll be pleased to distribute at the end of the testimony, just a brief overall statement of the federal budget by category and by type of expenditure. But through the kind of finagling that we've talked about, American corporations have reduced their share of income taxes paid from 24% of the budget to 12% in the last 20 years. And they've necessitated large classes of expenditures. We're spending $111.9 billion apparently in this fiscal year to maintain an army which is in fact a worldwide police system for the security of this American, let's now call it global wealth, with some sort of American parentage, right, that's now sort of encircling the world. The fact that we spend $146 billion on income security is to a large extent necessitated by the fact that there is a global system of production. The United States is going to play a decreasing role in it, that the United States is being underdeveloped as a country, that the international system of economics in fact conceals an international system of power, and that power no longer plays into the hands of the United States. Right? That it, like all other nations, is going to fall into a subsidiary position to the managers of the global economy, who could be captured very quickly in the largest 1,200 global corporations, which now account for 1/2 of the world's cash transactions. I think I'd like to kind of let it go right here and go into questions and see if we can move this along. I've wondered about this, and I suppose it is true. I used to think that there were purely domestic sorts of sectors. It always occurred to me that agriculture would be a domestic sector, but now you see things like the component parts of Big Macs are raised in Latin America. Right? The people of Chile have no food, but they just received a $60 million loan from the World Bank to grow some very fancy form of scallop, to harvest it off the Pacific shores, and to send it north for cash so they can pay for the interest payments to Citicorp and to Chase and the Rockefeller people. So that's not a domestic sector. Almost a half of the component parts of the American military sector are produced abroad, right, through farming out contracts by multinational corporations. So it's very, very difficult, except for local industries that operate purely a peripheral position in the economy, to say that there is an American business structure. There's a worldwide business structure. A lot of it sprang from the brow of the American economy, but it's certainly not American. It is of and for itself. Oh, the Agency for International Development takes everybody to the third world the way a maitre d' takes everybody to the table at a restaurant. It was set up to promote this sort of investment and does that in virtually every third world country except for those that have thrown it out. Right? And what's interesting is that the agency was formed in a way because the government was more concerned about the export of capital than corporations were. That the government was eager to promote American outposts of business, which they thought would bring political stability to the world after the Second World War, when there was this serious threat of the Soviet Union invading every country on earth, making them all speak Russian. Right? And whatever else I was told as a very young person. But it certainly is, and it certainly consciously plans, in conjunction with the global corporations, exactly what role any one individual nation is going to play. Right? They do marketing forecasts, they do surveys as to what sectors need expansion, and effectively they're an information gathering arm for the global corporations.
As an insider in American politics, as you are relatively speaking, could you tell an outsider like myself whether or not the issues you've described here, in the terms you've described them, are discussed in the hallowed halls of American Congress? And if so, what kind of response do they get?
To a surprising extent, particularly insofar as the multinationalization of business has made America lose its sovereignty. It's no longer possible for the federal government to conduct the normal economic operations that it conducts to modulate the economy. Right? It's impossible for the Federal Reserve Bank to expand the monetary supply of the country without the global corporations interfering. Right? It's impossible to create jobs by giving people $50. We found that out. It's also impossible to create jobs by giving them $100 or even $200. Right? Because the money ends up being funneled into the wealth machine of these largest 1,000 global corporations in the Fortune 500 in the United States. Right? So there is that sort of concern. Right? I don't think that very many members understand that the global corporations are going to create the need for effectively a worldwide economic planning mechanism to turn this entire thing around. And I think that one of the structural changes that Dr. Rhodes was talking about is the fact that there's going to have to be some form of formal planning in the United States economy. And that one of the next major political battles we're going to face in the Congress and in the nation is who's going to control that, who's going to decide what's going to be produced and how it's going to be produced and who's going to get it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Everett. Ehrlich, I'm sorry. Our next witness will be Ellen Chapnick. Ms. Chapnick is a former legal counsel for the United Mine Workers. She will present to us a case study for Amex Corporation. Ms. Chapnick.